who it's coming from because I back-traced it.
Episode 167 of Radio Free Innsmouth. Utilizing my sorceress powers, I have sensed.
And this is the kind of crap that my trolls do to fuck with me because they're jealous of my dark powers.
That some of you might be getting tired of the dungeon synth thing. Sorry about that.
I'm so sorry.
But with this episode, we are slowly going to be inching our way back towards standard black metal, if even only slightly, because we are leaving pure dungeon synth behind in favor of neo-folk dark wave medieval something or other. Alright, look, it's Graveland. Or rather, Graveland adjacent, because we are going to be talking about Rob Darken's other project, besides Graveland, one of the most important black metal bands of all time. He's been running a little bit of a weird musical experiment for the better part of a quarter century, known as Lord Wind. If you don't know who Graveland is,
Get a life. Get alive!
Oh, I'm just kidding. But Graveland is pretty important. He's the genesis of most of like the Polish black metal stuff. He's an important like right-wing figure in the black metal scene if that's your bag.
And hey folks, it's me again, back again with another video. Trying to get back to
You know, no judgment here, whatever you're into.
Yo, whatever. You do what you like to do, I do what I like to do, okay?
But even outside of that, Graveland, pretty important black metal band. I did an episode on them a long-ass time ago. I think it was good. I don't even remember. It might have sucked, but it seems like people liked it, so that might be a good place to start. But actually, this episode on Rob Darken's Stranger Ventures in Lord Wind will go into Graveland a little bit, because the interesting thing about Lord Wind is that the development of this project is very entwined with the musical development of Graveland as a whole. And it's also rather woven in with the development of another Polish act that had a similar sound. We'll get to that in a minute.
우리 동아리 실세는 바로
See, now you're curious. You're wondering what this mystery act's gonna be. But we gotta start out with the first Lord Wind. The first Lord Wind came out in 1996. It's called Forgotten Songs. It features elements that might be familiar to a lot of Graveland fans. It's got like the same keyboard patches. It's got pretty much the same drum machine sound from that one Full Moon album, so that's very nostalgic. And it's big on these like layered, jangly guitars and all that kind of stuff. But if you were to go for a more
black metal
version of the same thing, you'd end up with like Graveland. Lord Wind and Graveland always have a substantial amount of crossover in the kind of melodies he uses, some of the aesthetics. Lord Wind's sort of like a darker shadow of what Graveland is doing. It's like Graveland with the black metal taken out, and instead he's just playing acoustics and whatnot. Or maybe not acoustics, but like much cleaner guitar sounds. Very flangered out, very kind of like psychedelic in a way. I enjoy this album quite a bit, and I think that people out there that enjoy like Thousand Swords and such would probably do well to check this album out, because it's very much in the same aesthetic wheelhouse. These vocals, when they come up, you're going to see there's one thing about this album that I'm not crazy about. The vocals kind of sound like he's got a big tummy ache or some shit. So those aren't amazing, but the rest of it is really, really good musically. Big fan of that. And you'll notice at the end of the album, there's a track called Aryan Horde Heil. Now, what does that mean? Well, for starters, it means
FBI, open up!
in terms of optics, but in this instance, Aryan Horde doesn't mean a horde of Aryans. He's talking about a guy from a band known as Perunwit. So he's doing a shout out to this guy from this other group. What's the deal with that? Well, now we're going to get into that mystery act that's connected to Lord Wind, fairly closely intertwined with the entire Lord Wind catalog, as a matter of fact, and it goes back to the beginning. So here's what the first Perunwit album that came out roughly a year before the first Lord Wind album sounds like. On the very like guitar-oriented tracks on it, you could see how this kind of stuff definitely influenced Rob Darken's work in Lord Wind quite a bit. So it makes sense he would shout him out in the last track on the album. Because otherwise somebody'd be like, hey, you're just ripping off Perunwit, motherfucker. What the fuck are you doing? You dig? But elsewhere in the album, it actually gets very, very dungeon synthy. Whole lot more keyboards than even what was going on in Lord Wind. and it's quite a bit more minimalist and kind of trance-like. But if you enjoy that first Lord Wind album, and like me, you haven't listened to Perunwit that much until I started working on this episode, highly recommend early Perunwit, because it's very much a more dungeon synth spaced out take on Lord Wind, which is already a much more dungeon synth spaced out wacky take on Graveland. But getting back to Lord Wind...
I'm back! I'm back! I'm back! I'm back!
The second Lord Wind album, entitled Heralds of Fight, which isn't great English, but it's cool enough, I guess, does not sound like the first Lord Wind album at all. It's way heavier on the synths, the guitar is completely absent, and it's a little bit more dungeon synthy, or like dungeon synth adjacent. It's much more martial and angry sounding, less atmospheric and mysterious. This is probably the closest he's gotten to doing like straight up video game music. Except for like later on, Lord Wind actually did a couple like songs for video game soundtracks. But that's besides the point. This stuff is very martial, aggressive, proud sounding. Good stuff. The Heralds of Fight title, it's not good English, but it fits with what's going on here. And it's got the same sort of keyboard patches you always hear in Graveland. I also really like those like super sonorous horns and brass sections. Very Anton Bruckner. But I mentioned earlier how Lord Wind is always sort of like a dark mirror of what Graveland is doing. Well, around the time this second Lord Wind album came out, Graveland's sound had substantially changed. Now they're a little bit more like this. Much slower pace to the music than what you might hear on Thousand Swords or Carpathian Wolves. The guitars aren't nearly as like strange with all the different effects. The drumming isn't as kind of tribal and busy as it used to be. It's much more militaristic sounding. So you can see how Lord Wind was kind of taking on characteristics of Graveland at the time. Meanwhile, over in a Perunwit land, they had started sounding quite a bit like a Wojnar, with the push-pull dynamic between clean vocals and more hoarse, shouty stuff. And then like substantially more minimalistic arrangements. A lot of negative space to the composition. Gives you time to think about things. I really like this guy's guitar playing. It's very unique. And then check this out. Getting very, very aggressive. Much more aggressive than they used to be. In fact, this might remind you of something. It's
Hold your dick for 1 second, you fungal rim job.
fairly similar to post-Thousand Swords, but pre-mid-paced era Graveland. They're just playing it with like cleaner guitars and overall less aggressive sound, but there it is. So it's interesting how these two groups of musicians are kind of having like a back and forth, a bit of a dialogue as they both take influence from each other. And then we get to the third Lord Wind album, Rites of the Valkyries, which I'm probably going to skip. Look, I'm sorry, it's a very good album. It's actually got way better production than Heralds of Fight does, but I can't help but see it as sort of like a dry run for concepts that he would perfect on the fourth Lord Wind album, Atlantean Monument, which I remember when that album came out, that was a huge deal for me. It was my favorite album in the world for a very long time. And as far as Rob Darken, the Graveland guy's work goes, my favorite stuff is always going to be like Thousand Swords and Following the Voice of Blood, but this one's right up there. This is some of the best shit he ever did. It features a hefty amount of influence from Basil Polidors's Conan the Barbarian soundtrack, what makes sense because what Rob Darken is doing with this album is something very similar to what old Robert E. Howard did with the Conan stories. He's sort of making like an alternate past history that everybody forgot about and then trying to develop a culture based around that, which as a teenager I found that very inspiring. This album has really cool composition where it has these long weaving melodies that like what you're hearing right now. And then the drums are probably my favorite part of it because he's brought back that sort of tribal character that Capricornus had back in the old Graveland stuff, but he's doing it with these kind of like kettle drum sounding things, and it's just really cool. There's a lot of layered choir arrangements arrangements on this one. And it still all sounds synthetic, but it's a good kind of synthetic. It has its own sort of vibe to it. It doesn't like sound fakey. So overall, Atlantean Monument, one of the best Lord Wind albums, one of my favorite albums just like in general. Go and get this. The first time I tried recording this episode, it was just all samples of Atlantean Monument. It was going on way too long, so I'm just going to leave you with that one. If you liked what you heard on that, you're going to love all the different places this album goes. Meanwhile, Perunwit were also very much changing their sound. There's a lot more black metal. In fact, they're just a black metal band now. Albeit a black metal band that utilizes a lot more clean guitar and kind of weird layering than would be expected for the genre. Also a lot of Rock Against Communism influence. Quite a bit punky, but then it's got these like little neoclassical flourishes. Very unique stuff. There's also a lot of Bathory going on, as you would expect. And I really like the dichotomy between like lead guitar and then these like very hard edge kind of chugging guitars. It brings to mind Belarusian comrades Apraxia as well as God's Tower. And you know I love both of those bands, so of course I'm going to like when Perunwit starts doing similar stuff. So yeah, that's the weird back and forth that Lord Wind and Perunwit had going on. Like, Lord Wind started out as this weird side project with Rob Darken where he was essentially almost covering Perunwit, ended up going in its own direction, and then Perunwit just started taking a whole bunch of black metal influence primarily from Graveland. So weird little back and forth those guys had. As I mentioned earlier, Atlantean Monument is like one of my favorite albums of all time, but when I was listening to it at the time, I figured, okay, this is like the culmination of Lord Wind. Like, I don't know how you're gonna build from there, but the seeds were planted for later Lord Wind back on Atlantean Monument, if you listen closely. On the song The Shining Eyes of the Misty Witch, he started utilizing more stringed instruments, kind of hinting at where he was going to go with the following Lord Wind album. Because normally he's just famous for the choirs and shit, but there were little hints of what was going to happen later on once we get to the next Lord Wind album. Entitled Alice Stenar, named after a big old Paleolithic stone boat setting over in Sweden. Has actual violin on it, so that's really cool stuff. More acoustic instruments. And it has lots of like cool zithers and shit too. Alice Stenar is a wonderful follow-up to Atlantean Monument, and I think the only reason I haven't listened to it as much is I just don't have the nostalgic attachment to it because it came out a lot later. But solid continuation. Songs like this one, you hear a whole bunch of Dead Can Dance influence, which was always there, but it's made very explicit as you go farther into this album. So Alice Stenar, if you like Atlantean Monument, you'll love this too. It's very similar. And then we get into the final Lord Wind album. This is where everything comes full circle, because I'm not going to talk about Perunwit anymore. I got to like their newest album, that last sample I played, but what ended up happening is pretty much all of Perunwit ends up joining Lord Wind.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
So Lord Wind is officially a band now with multiple people. Technically, this got started on Alice Stenar because you had Alruna, one of the violin players from Perunwit, providing guest violin, but now there's like pretty much the entirety of Perunwit is in Lord Wind now, which makes 2019's The Forest Is My Kingdom album a very interesting evolution of the Lord Wind sound. There's no keyboards anymore. Now it's all acoustic instruments. Rob Darken handles most of the drums. We got multiple violin players, some kind of wacky like Cossack mandolin instrument that I can't pronounce. And it has a really nice energy to it. Especially when the music picks up, starts getting a little bit faster. Very step nomad type shit. And it's catchy in its own way. I think it's busy enough that it'll even enthrall the minds of those who don't really like neofolk. Also, vocals are back in Lord Wind for the first time since the very first album, although obviously very different than Rob Darken's standard rumble. Now we have like dual female vocalists, and like they're going back and forth with these like very dense string arrangements. A lot of cool stuff going on in this album. That's my other favorite Lord Wind album besides Atlantean Monument. So if you're gonna get any two, I would say get those. I know a lot of people like Forgotten Songs the most, you know, and there's probably like some hardcore Heralds of Fight and Rites of the Valkyrie stands out there. Lord Wind overall, really cool band. Not what you would expect from something that's like nominally ambient music. It's all very busy and active and interesting. And hopefully that kept you interested for this entire episode. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye! But for real though, Lord Wind and Perunwit both make excellent music, and I find something very inspiring in how these two groups' catalogs are essentially a dialogue between two very talented groups of people. Kind of like a back and forth of ideas, each improving the other one. I find it very uplifting in a way, and you wouldn't expect that from black metal supposed to be negative and shit, right? But I guess that's the purpose of art, is even if it gets like really dark, it's supposed to like ameliorate the rather dismal experience of living life. Maybe not in, like the same way as just like popping pills or something degenerate like that would, but there it is. See you around.
Crackers want to glide, then